and it's because of an airplane. So I think this is where our board is excited to try to leverage our existing system to find a way that these new alternatively powered aircraft that are more economically feasible, more environmentally feasible, that are scaled size-wise more to some of the market communities that we have, and how we can use this existing network of infrastructure in these airports without building expensive new runways and taxiways. How can we leverage those to improve the way Coloradans move in our state? So this is where it leads into some of the things I know Scott was going to talk about powering the future of aviation. And there's a lot of cool things on the horizon. One that's being developed right here in Colorado is the new two-seat by Aerospace E-Flyer. It's a two-seat single-engine general aviation training aircraft that I think is really going to fundamentally change the cost and the ease of flight training. And it's no secret, if you've been following the news, there's a big pilot shortage. It takes a lot of hours and experience to become a pilot. It takes a lot of expense. We're excited because here in Colorado, we have a lot of big flight schools, including the U.S. Air Force undergraduate pilot training program is here in Colorado. How we can leverage these new electric airplanes to make flight training more cost-effective, quieter for the airports and their communities, and more cost-effective for the folks learning how to fly. But what we really get excited about here, I think, and what really it juices me is what the new era of regional air mobility will look like with airplanes like this. And I know a lot of you folks have seen Magna X out of Seattle. I know David will talk a little bit about it. In fact, I think his presentation has the exact same picture of the Cessna Caravan that they're developing that will be converted from PT6 turboprop power to battery electric. Also up in Washington State, other cool stuff going on. Aviation is very close to test flying the Alice, that aircraft in the lower right. That's a 9-seat, 440 nautical mile range, 250 knot aircraft that is battery electric. And I think that is the kind of airplane that we're going to see as airlines like Cape Air and some other folks are looking at those kinds of aircraft. We'll really see new opportunities for air service where it's just not economically feasible today. Here's the beauty for those of you not in the aviation world about this airplane in the right. There's a magic number about that 9 seats. If you're flying an aircraft that has 9 seats or less, you do not have to have TSA security. You do not have to fly into an airport that has full FAA Part 139 certification. You can fly that aircraft between urban centers and between rural communities without all the added expense and hassle of TSA. And obviously, you don't get to fly into a secure airport like a Denver International or an Aspen with that kind of an airplane unless you go through TSA. But if you want to fly between 2 small communities in a small aircraft, this is really going to change, I think, the way folks move on relatively short legs flights. Now here in Colorado, what I get really interested in, again, going back to my initial comment about the terrain, if you want to fly an aircraft from Denver anywhere west under current FAA rules, you either have to have an aircraft that's pressurized or you're going to have to fly at an altitude that requires your passengers to put on an oxygen mask. I'm a huge aviation history buff. I doubt there's a lot of affinity for a lot of folks today to strap on an oxygen mask like they used to have to in the 1930s and 40s before the advent of pressurized aircraft. So one of the things we're very fascinated in with Colorado is the fact that the Alice right now is the only pressurized battery electric aircraft that's close to flying. And so the Caravan, unfortunately, on the upper left is a great airplane. It's a proven airplane that's been flying for decades, but it's not pressurized. And that would make flying in Colorado's high country a little bit challenging. The other thing that gets us really excited about these aircraft, especially battery electric, is that a high altitude state like Colorado, we're home to Colorado's highest commercial service airport. That was the airport I showed you in my front slide in Telluride. It's almost 10,000 feet MSL. It's a very challenging airport, especially when it's hot. For those of you that may not be pilots in the room, when you combine high altitude and high temperature, you get reduced air density. And when you're flying a traditionally powered, even a jet aircraft, but especially a piston aircraft at reduced air densities, your power is decreased. And when your power is decreased, your aircraft performance goes down and you have to leave one of 3 things or 2 of 3 things behind: baggage, people or fuel. And so the best part about electric aircraft is while you do get a little bit of a loss with airfoil and propellers, electric engines, electric motors don't lose power at high altitude like a traditional jet engine or a reciprocating piston engine. So this will have the ability to really make sure that we're flying flights in Colorado that are full, even on the hottest, highest days here in Colorado. So again, I think there's other benefits that we're seeing there. But I think beyond battery electric aircraft, what we really get excited about, and I know Scott's going to talk a little bit about some of the cool work that NREL is doing, is if you want to go up to a larger airplane, there's just simply not the battery technology that's there to power something like a 737 or even a regional aircraft that seats 50 to 70 people. The battery technology and the density is just not there. And I think that's where we get excited because we see things like Zero Avia looking at hydrogen hybrid aircraft where you use a hydrogen fuel cell to generate electricity instead of a battery. And, here's an example of a well-proven de Havilland Q400-8 regional airliner that they're working on right now to convert to hydrogen hybrid electric in partnership with Alaska Airlines, who's actually donated a Q400 airframe. This is great. It's a 76-seat, high-performance, short-range regional airplane, and I think hydrogen is another opportunity that we as DOTs are going to have to look at. How can we help not only get our airports ready for electric aircraft, but how about hydrogen? That's going to take new infrastructure. It's going to take new distribution, new safety regulations. But it's going to be a way to, again, fundamentally lower the cost and the environmental impact of aviation across the country. And of course, the last thing that I'll touch on here that we're also very interested in here in Colorado, and again, I know Scott's going to talk a little bit about it from NREL's perspective, is of course sustainable aviation fuel. And in a nutshell, I think you've all heard of this. You've seen a lot of news about airlines using it. It's aviation fuel that is made from biomass or through chemical processes rather than being pulled out of the ground and then refined like traditional jet fuel. There's a lot of opportunities here. The production needs to be scaled up. It's not widely available. The fuel that is available is much more expensive than traditional jet fuel stocks at this point in time. But I think as you see a push to convert waste products, whether it's forestry or cooking oil or household waste or landfill waste, into jet fuel, you have the ability to continue to power these larger airplanes that just are never, at least face it, in our lifetime going to be run on batteries, but certainly can run on sustainable aviation fuel. So I think over the next few years, you'll see a bigger push to incentivize the production and distribution of SAF or sustainable aviation fuel across the country. And of course, for me as an aeronautics director, in a division that's funded by aviation fuel taxes, I love SAF, and I think most of my counterparts do, because guess what? It's taxed just like a regular gallon of fuel is today, so it doesn't take any major changes to our funding structure, at least here in Colorado. So that's sort of what we're looking at here. I'm very excited here in Colorado. Our aeronautics board has approved a significant amount of funding for us to do a study here in Colorado that we're going to kick off in August in partnership with NREL and their partners at NASA to take a look at where people move in Colorado and where we might be able to start thinking about investments to facilitate and incentivize this new technology when it actually starts hitting the market in the next decade or so. We really want to be on the forefront to say, if you've got an airplane that is powered by one of these new fuel sources, we've got place for you in Colorado, and we can use your technology to help people move around more efficiently. And that's what our DOT is really all about. How do we make people's lives better and enable business and transportation within the state of Colorado, but do so in a way that our people expect here in our state? They expect it to be clean and efficient and responsible, and as minimally impactful on the environment as we can. And that's our task, directly down from our governor through our aeronautics board. And we're really happy to have NREL literally right in our backyard here in Denver. I've known Scott for the better part of 20 years, looking forward to partnering with him. But that's our story here in Colorado. Again, I'm happy to chat more with other folks. If you missed it, there's a great picture of the Telluride Airport, again, North America's highest commercial service airport, up there in the south central part of the state. And I would say maybe one of the most beautiful airports in the lower 48. But Marie, thank you for the opportunity to participate. I really appreciate it. And I will turn it back to you.
Thanks. We really appreciate hearing about this. Let's see, one more question, and actually let's open it up to questions now since you have to leave early while we're getting Scott's presentation back. Can you say a little bit more about how you're working with airports already, David?
So we've really had some preliminary discussions, Marie, with I think some of the more forward-thinking airports in the state about potentially engaging in our study. But I think the first part of the study that we're going to undertake with NREL is going to be sort of an analysis of where people are traveling within Colorado, where are they coming from, where are they going to, what modes are they using, and then based on that data, we'll identify some regions and some key airports in those regions that we start discussions with. I've talked with David Fleckenstein. Look, we would love, every single one of our state DOT directors, we would love to electrify every one of our public use airports and have them ready to go. But unfortunately, that just is not fiscally or technically feasible. So we've got to sort of narrow it down and prioritize those from a state level. And that's what our study with NREL will help us do, is to sort of focus on the key airports we need to start having those discussions with.
Are you working with your own CDOT travel demand modelers by any chance?
We have a little bit. Unfortunately, the demand models that they have are very focused on highways at this point.
Right.
And we also want to do a little more detailed analysis about how people move by air intrastate. But the good news is with us, we're part of a larger DOT, and our my counterparts in our transportation planning group are incredibly excited for us to share the data that we come up with, because it will certainly help them on the highway side as well.
Okay. So folks, you can ask questions in the chat if you would like. And I have to admit that I have been focusing on the presentation, and I'm just looking back right now and not seeing any, but if you feel free to raise your hand, and some of you are unmuted already, those who got here early, and we're glad to answer questions. If I'm missing you right now, what I would encourage you to do is just put your question in the chat. David will see it, and the rest of us will see it too. We'll try to make sure it's covered. But it looks like Scott Carey from NREL is ready now. So Scott, take it away.
Okay, let's check audio this way. Is this better?
Super.
Okay, we got rid of headphones. Zoom does not like headphones today, so we're just not going to use those. Okay, Dave started running through some of the discussions on what happens within the different types of energy carriers. We're starting this as a system, so we think about the energy carriers, the fuels, the ecosystem, which is the 5,000 plus airports across the nation, plus the routing between those airports and the aircraft. And historically, what's been able to occur is that the aircraft manufacturers know that they're going to use either 100 low lead or effectively kerosene as their primary fuel, and that the rest of that infrastructure is available for the most part wherever they want to fly. Well, now we have this new generation of aircraft coming out where that's not necessarily the case. And so we have an infrastructure need that needs to catch up to aircraft that are already starting to move through certification. And these all link up. Now, if we just look at, say biofuels, SAF, as an example, there potentially are trade-offs if we look at it from a system level. There's only a certain amount of feedstock in the US and in different regions. And so where is that feedstock going to be used? Is it going to be used for biodiesel, where it's currently the most cost effective for the refiners? Or is it going to be used for aviation, as an example? Or in the case of one of the carriers, which is fats, oils, and greases, is it taking away agricultural product from food? These are the types of interdependencies that start to come into play. And so really need to step back and think about this as a system, just like you have to do for the transportation systems. Okay, so why aren't we just going straight to electric and staying there? I think the key item that Dave started to go down this road already, which is petroleum is very energy dense. And so and if you have to carry more energy over longer distances, right now the batteries are too heavy to take you on very long distances with large payloads. And the map you're looking, or the chart you're looking at is from an ATAG waypoint study done looking at 2050. And it's doing a pretty good job of what we're seeing already occurring, which is that hydrogen and electric are improving in their technologies and the viability to start to take on some of the commuter and regional routes potentially by 2030 or maybe 2035. And then when you get to short haul right now, it's, most likely that's going to get up into 2040 before one of those can pick up. But when you get to medium and long haul, liquid fuel, whether that is a biofuel, petroleum, or a new generation, they're called power liquids, which is you take hydrogen and some type of source of carbon and make a liquid fuel that looks like kerosene effectively. That will be around for a fairly long time, it appears, in medium to long haul. So there's not one solution, is what I think the key takeaway here is. Okay, big thing we look at is each of these different next generation energy sources, whether it's sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, e-fuels, which are called the power to liquid fuels, the hydrogen or the electricity. They each have a supply chain that has to get from where it's sourced to that aircraft to be used for transportation. And each are unique. Each have challenges and each have benefits. And as you move through that process, we'll get to electric here in just a minute, but each of them are going to have their own discussions. Example, if you want to do SAF right now, SAF has to be trucked into many of the markets and then blended. Hydrogen right now is trucked because the pipelines only exist in a few regions, as an example. Electricity, the discussion is, okay, can we ramp the power requirements, the locations people want it at the peaks that they would like. We're going to just, sustainable aviation fuel is the current viable solution to help reduce carbon emissions. So the DOT, DOE, USDA, FAA have all gotten together and are moving forward on what's called the SAF Grand Challenge, trying to have 35 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel available by 2050. The technologies already exist. There's already 7 pathways that are approved by ASTM. There's actually 9 if you count another certification process. And they are moving forward. Some of the challenges are just scaling and cost. And so those are weighing in on some of these discussions with SAF. Now let's talk about hydrogen. Hydrogen right now, there's also a strong movement here is that hydrogen sourced from clean sources, effectively wind and solar, and potentially depending on if you get into the color scales, you can call it nuclear, does not have emissions, air emissions as an example, can be used, can provide long-term storage. And the other component here is that for sustainable aviation fuel, hydrogen is a key component that can actually make those products more viable more quickly. So you take a feedstock and then you actually add hydrogen to make it look like kerosene. So within the hydrogen space, there's the Hydrogen Hub program that's, I believe, is a little over $8 billion that's being put out to match and work with industry to start to build some of this infrastructure in regional nodes around the nation. So this is moving forward right now to be able to build nodes. The Department of Energy is started to scale this program to say, is it viable on a industry basis using forklifts? And I heard an anecdote here in the last couple weeks that roughly 1/3 of the food in the United States is moved by a hydrogen forklift, as an example, in warehouses. So the Earthshot, With hydrogen, the DOE is also pushing to say, let's move this technology and scale this to where we can get hydrogen down to $1 per kilogram per decade in a decade for the cost. A kilogram of hydrogen is about the same amount of energy density that's in a gallon of Jet A, as an example. So this is the bulk cost, and then you have delivery that goes with that. You have ZeroAvia, you have Cranfield Aerospace, you have Universal Hydrogen, you have Airbus, all working in on hydrogen, trying to figure out how to start to blend that into the system. The FAA is also contributing, and this interest continues to grow. So now to where we really want to talk about today is electrified aviation. Marie started to talk about a case study we did on essential air service. We looked at routes out of Colorado, out of Denver, that were being serviced by essential air service using a Pilatus PC-12 that could be serviced by a 9-seat electric aircraft. And the map you see on the right-hand side is the electrical grid in Nebraska, Colorado, and down at the bottom, you get in the corner of Utah and Arizona. And the thicker the line, the higher the voltage, which generally means more capacity. And these 4 routes are subsidized. It's important for those communities, as many of you know, to keep air service. But for anywhere from 1,300 to 5,600 enplanements, the average was roughly about $3 million of subsidies to keep this service alive. Now, the reason we looked at this way was to say, is there a market in essential air service for this type of aircraft? We did this based on $5 a gallon Jet A, this study, and the fuel costs are roughly 1/10 of the cost for using Jet A, if you can get your rates aligned appropriately. With that, then, if you just went straight to the current mix out of, now we use Cortez, Colorado, which is a fairly strong coal base, it was roughly the equivalent amount of CO2 emissions. But if you went to a clean source, which is where majority of utilities are going right now, you effectively got rid of your emissions overall, globally, not just locally, but globally. And then we looked and said, okay, what does that mean in terms of charging? We are assuming on this size of aircraft, they're going to be looking at essentially the Class 8 heavy truck level of charging, roughly a megawatt, called megawatt standards. And the instantaneous request for energy would be roughly double that, so 2 megawatts per aircraft. And that would be the peak, as you know, when it first starts and the battery is in a certain range. And then it'll taper off because it protects the battery and things. But if 2 aircraft dropped into Denver, and this is the actual routing that we used from 2019, 2 aircraft coming in meant an instantaneous request for 4 megawatts at Denver. That is roughly 1/10 of Denver's daily load is 2 aircraft. So
Is that
what that means?
DIA's daily load or Denver?
Yes.
The city of Denver.
Den.
Okay. Yeah, got it.
DIA is.
Wow.
So what the outcomes that we saw out of that were, 1 is there is market, and 2, there's work that needs to be done on charging, just like there is on Class 8 trucks. The labs have been spending a lot of time on the Class 8 trucking industry, supporting the megawatt charging standards that are should be approved here fairly soon, and testing up to, Chart is testing up to 3.75 megawatts of charging. That means the electrical infrastructure either has to have a way to store that energy close to where you're going to request, which is going to, we expect is going to be part of the solution. But then you also have to make sure that the infrastructure up to that location are in place, or come up with some sort of way to travel with big batteries. The discussion of a fuel bowser, basically have 2 charges of an aircraft on a tractor trailers has come up a few times, but you're doubling your infrastructure cost by doing that because that still has to charge somewhere. There currently is not a standard within aviation for the chargers. eVTOL is moving towards existing automotive standards, 350 kW and megawatt standards. Regional air mobility, which is what we're talking about, the fixed wing, 9-seat size and larger, is going to the megawatt level and higher to try and meet their needs and meet their turn times. With that, I will say that SAE is trying to move through and obtain some standards. A few of the manufacturers have said, at least on eVTOL, have said we are going to use this standard, and there is some coalescence around that. Next slide. Oh, that's me. Sorry, I was losing my mind today. So, how does this matter at the airports on the ground? Well, each airport is affected. We look at it as essentially a small city, and not every airport has all these components. But you think about a hotel; it's housing. When you think about large loads, you're going to have potentially buses, cars. You're going to have liquid fuels. You have sometimes service, and then you have 24-hour-a-day facilities that need to move goods and passengers. In many cases, even the smallest airports and all across the nation are being used for medevac and other critical needs in these communities. And so thinking about it from that perspective, having a stable energy source for your transportation needs is extremely important. If you start to transition away from those tanks of fuel that are available on that airport, that provides a buffer if there's a disruption in power. You need to start to plan to say, okay, we need to be able to think about this as a system and make sure that we can keep that same level of consistency. The first thing we always say is start by reducing your loads. Do everything you can to lower the loads on your airport. It leaves more room in your existing transmission systems coming in, but most likely you're going to have to start to think about this from an overall energy plan at these locations and then move from there. So who's working on this? A lot of people are. The FAA is working from SAF to electrification to hydrogen. We're helping them with some of their background work at the Hughes Technical Center. Department of Defense is working through a program called Agility Prime, trying to help some of the manufacturers that are flying or near flying get technology viable or get viable for certification. AFRL is working on SAF and some other things. DOE, NASA, DOT, the DOTs that we're talking to, and I'm sure more of you on the phone are all working on this. So there are resources available. The national labs are here to help everyone. And so if there's research that's already been completed, we are more than willing to try and steer you towards that research. Everything that the lab system is doing is intended to be available for everyone to use across the nation. This is just a sampling of resources that are available, and there are more that continue to evolve. And that's what we have for today.
Thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate you joining us, and it's wonderful to know that your work is available for all of the DOTs, really everyone. We have already had a request for your presentation, actually. So if you can share that, just send it to me and we'll get it out. So if it's okay, Scott, we're going to go with this question to David first, and then see if we have some questions of you too. Gabrielle, can you speak?
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, perfect. So I'm an aviation planner at Caltrans, so California DOT, and we have over 240 airports, ranging from San Francisco International to, way out in the boonies. And I think regional air mobility is very interesting and could definitely be applied here in California. And so I was wondering, the study kind of finishes and you identify the key airports for regional air mobility in Colorado, what does the DOT intend to do to act on that to promote regional air mobility?
That's a great question, Gabrielle. Thanks for that. I think the way that we're sort of framing this scope of work with this now, and this may change as we move forward, but after we identify sort of the key markets and the key airports, I think the next thing for us to do is to really do a gap analysis and say, okay, with that market and with the travel information that we have, what would the demand be for electric aircraft charging infrastructure? And is that supportable in that community today? And if not, how do you pay for that gap? I think, Scott talked about, the power demands of electric airplanes are amazing. And when you think of one airplane taking up 10% of the total electrical usage at a major hub airport like Denver International, we really are concerned about the ability of small airports to support regional airplanes, and whether there's not even enough electrical capacity in their community to support that. That's one of the things we're going to have to find out. And if there's not, start dialogue with energy cooperatives and local REAs and things like that to figure out how do we get the electrical system up to speed to support these airplanes. That would be our next step after that. We hope to engage sort of a small working group with some air carriers, local electrical utilities, and some folks like that to help us inform that. But there may be a lot of infrastructure investments needed, not just on the airport, but way off the airport to support all of this at small airports, not just small airports here in Colorado, but pretty much any small airport.
Yeah, that's super.
I hope that answers. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
And I would add on to that is that so the work that's being planned with the state of Colorado is an extension of work that we're doing with NASA right now. The NASA RAM study, they looked at what's demand in the Mid-Atlantic region for this type of service. We're putting the energy layer onto that study right now. One of the things we're still working through some of the assumptions, but one of the things that is a place that we see both in ground vehicles and also in aviation is the question is, how long is the vehicle going to be on the ground? If it's a 30-minute turn, that's a bigger issue than if these are remain overnights, as an example. And then if you're at Inyokern versus somewhere closer to a large substation, thinking about California, different topic as well. And so some of those discussions are down to the point of maybe that the route planning is for half of the available capacity of that aircraft for some of those remote locations. And so maybe you wouldn't charge at that location, just like you wouldn't have fuel at some of those locations.
Yeah, I read through the study. Right now it's very high level. So I'm just interested in getting down to how it gets to like the actionable pieces that like we can do as our part as the DOT.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll all be excited to see that. Going on with what you were talking about, Scott, and I wonder if you might turn back to that table with some of the costs. But do you have maps of all those substations so that you're able to have those? Yes, I think you just went past it. Those dialogues, and also how do these costs compare? Or is it's the next one? I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the initial map is actually the U.S. as a portion of the U.S. Transmission and distribution lines.
Okay.
And we started just by saying, how close is a substation to the airport? Assuming you're going to go back to the substation with the the costs are really dependent on the location and the utility. And so part of this is to get the awareness up, both for the operators, but also for the utilities to say, if you're going to be a part of this, which you most likely will have to be, how do we build this into your system? The certification process for aircraft is 3 to 7 years. Well, to get a a substation upgrade could be 2 to 5 or more, especially if they aren't clear of what is being requested. And so you put those together, we saw a gap starting to build where aircraft were in certification, but the infrastructure wasn't starting. But that seems to be being heard by the aircraft manufacturers at this point, with some trying to get the initial use case of smaller chargers out to some of these airports to support their needs and potentially others. So the 350 kW size is what at least one manufacturer is trying to get installed.
Thanks, tons. Yeah, it would be interesting to learn more about that and maybe devote a future webinar to that. Now, Scott, on the first line here, just to make sure I'm reading this right. So is it, would this cost, $440 for fuel currently, or like what would that be now with the increased fuel costs? And is that's versus
I don't know what
43
the
in
yeah,
electricity?
you
So
got it.
1/10?
Yep. 1/10 and we used $5 a gallon.
Okay. And you don't, David, do you or anyone know what that airline fuel cost is right now? The Jet
Marie,
A?
it varies. Yeah, it varies so much. The airlines are pretty low key about that, depending on how much they buy. But from what we understand on our revenues right now, it's about $3 to $4 a gallon is today what airlines are paying at wholesale, non-taxed. That does not include tax.
Okay. How much is tax? I'm showing my ignorance.
That is a great question. Here in Colorado, it's 2.9% of the price, and then there's a federal excise tax, which I should know off the top of my head. But please don't quote that. That can vary
Sure.
wildly. United Airlines will pay a lot less for fuel than a smaller air carrier like Allegiant or somebody like that.
Okay.
Yeah, and we just used the retail rate is what we had to
Right.
find a published rate. So we started with $5 because that was the published rate.
Okay.
As a starting point. So that's 1/10. So we've been saying, 1/5 to 1/10.
Okay.
Even if it was instead of 5, if it was, let's just say it was 4, and you start to go through and you start to see those numbers, you're still seeing a dramatic difference.
Okay.
The key item is being able to manage the how you request energy from the utility. Because
Right.
utilities charge for peaks because it
Yeah.
disrupts their system. And that's something we spend a lot of time with some of our clients working on.
Okay. So Elizabeth, are you able to speak, Elizabeth Lennon?
I can speak, but can you hear me?
I can hear you. So you can go ahead
Wonderful.
and ask your question about this in relation to hydrogen.
Yes, so thank you for the presentations. I'm here from the New York State DOT. I am not an aviation head. My involvement would be interest in reducing greenhouse gas emissions that stem from the aviation portion of the transportation system. And there is a lot of interest in that, as you well know. When I heard that you just shared that 2 of those aircrafts charging at the same time would demand 4 megawatts, which is equal to about 1/10 of Denver's airport electricity demand. I got a little concerned because aviation is supposed to increase, right? People are going to fly more and more. And so how would an airport ever be able to come up with that demand? So my question basically is hydrogen more of a future fuel to go after? Does it have more potential than the electric battery aircraft, powered aircraft?
So the way that we've kind of thought through that so far is that each of these has different uses and different pros and cons. So when you think about small aircraft, say flight schools, it's a 2-seater. It does multiple turns, and getting that cost down to make flight school more cost effective. they can generally put in the size of chargers that would be effective and move forward. If you're talking about an occasional route, or say you can actually put in some energy storage at that airport, then you'll be, I think of it as, you turn on your hose and you're just filling your tank up over time, and you just fill it up over time, and then you discharge it very quickly into the less frequent amount of aircraft that come through at that 9-seat range. And then it moves back out. Where hydrogen really is a good place is that you can move hydrogen about as fast as you can move petroleum in terms of the speed. Now, right now, New York is in a fairly good place because you have some infrastructure to move hydrogen, but most parts of the nation don't. And so then you get into the question of what's the trucking cost to move that hydrogen to those locations and store it in some way, or generate it on site, or like through what NYSERDA and the rest of your groups are doing right now with the offshore wind. Any excess capacity ideally would be used to make a durable storage product, and hydrogen is one of those. So I don't have an answer, but the longer distance you get, the more likely that hydrogen plays a role. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
And I think, Marie, there's another question there from
Yeah.
William about standard for charging systems across manufacturers. There's not yet. That's one of the things that is still being developed. It's not nearly as far along as it is on the automobile. So certainly that's another piece of the infrastructure puzzle that has to be figured out sometime soon too.
Thanks so much for jumping on that question. Can one of you also speak, perhaps David again, to what FAA will fund at this point in terms of preparation at airports?
I can speak a little bit of that, Marie. It's really virtually none at this point, and that's another one of the policy things that's going to have to be addressed. The FAA does help administer the voluntary airport low emissions program. That's been largely focused to date on ground service equipment and gate power and things like that. But one of the things that we're all going to have to tackle as states is the FAA's holy grail of AIP eligibility for the airport improvement program funding, and broadening some of the things that are eligible for funding under that, so that if an airport does want to use its funding for electric aircraft infrastructure, that it's eligible. Today, that is not the case. So there's a change that will have to happen with that.
Is that something that AASHTO could even get involved with, or would it be through your other association only, do you think? Or
AASHTO might, Marie. I think for us, and I know David and I are both active participants in NASAO. It's the National Association of State Aviation Officials. It's the aviation analog to AASHTO. We work hand in glove with AASHTO on a lot of issues. Secretary Lorenz from Kansas is the aviation chair for AASHTO, and we work very, very hand in glove with her. So collectively, yes, but I think it's probably up to NASAO and some of the airport associations to help carry that water going forward.
Mm-hmm. Is that happening that you see so far?
It's not yet, because we don't all, I don't think, know what to ask for. And I think that's, the study we're doing here in Colorado will help inform that. I think what David's going to talk about here in a little bit will also help do that. So that's what we're hoping to do, is help say, here are some of the things on airport that will be needed that you ought to think about, UFAA ought to think about allowing us to fund.
That's terrific. Well, I can tell you that we will, if you communicate it to me, or probably some of the other people on this call too, but we can get it into the AASHTO planning newsletter, and get you some support there, hopefully. So just stay in touch.
That would be great. And if I might hijack Scott's screen real quick, and then I'll make sure we leave enough time for David. But I think what you'll see that's not unusual among states, if you can all see that. Here's a map of all the electric utility providers in Colorado. There's a lot of them. Some of them are very small. Some of them are very remote. Some of them might not have the resources to do the things that need to happen at some of these small airports. A lot of folks think of Xcel Energy. I know that's a broad energy provider, not just here in Colorado. They're one of the biggest ones nationally. But if you look at the dark gray on this map, Xcel Energy, from a geographic standpoint, serves very little of Colorado. And so that's another challenge we'll have, is there may not be appetite with some of these utilities to want to do anything more than what they're providing today. And we'll have some things to work on with that. So I'm guessing every state in the US has a map that looks a lot like this, with a lot of little providers.
Thanks so much. Are there any other questions that we've missed? And anyone who's unmuted is welcome to speak.
Marie,
let's see.
there's a question about hydrogen fuel cells.
Great. Yeah, can you get that?
Sure. So right now the work that Zero Avi is doing, we understand, is intended to use an electric motor with a hydrogen fuel cell. So you do not burn hydrogen. There is discussion out of some of the turbine engine manufacturers, and it's actually been done before, is you can actually burn hydrogen. When you think about the energy that's needed to make hydrogen, to then burn it and get, say, a 40% efficiency instead of an 80 or 90% efficiency, it might work better for some of the existing airframes, but it's not nearly as efficient. First thing. Second thing is, when you're burning hydrogen, you have to be very careful, because you do get emissions, different emissions off of burning hydrogen, that can also impact GHG, whether that's water vapor or other issues. And so, no, I think at least one of the OEMs is looking at how do they capture the water that's generated, the water vapor that's generated from their processes, trying to capture that and not have another impact as trying to clean things up.
That is so interesting. Thanks for mentioning that. You know, water as the only emission, or at least the one we hear most about on the ground, is such a feature of hydrogen. But of course, in the air higher up, you know, it contributes to, make things warmer, or, contributes to GHG. Are there any other emissions we should be thinking about with hydrogen? I have to admit, that's not my area.
I've heard it, but I haven't. I don't have it that one committed to memory. I try and keep up with our researchers, just put it that way, and make sure aviation is discussed. But that was one of the discussions. I thought it was in the nitrogens, but I can't say that for sure.
Okay, if you find out, definitely email. Absolutely. And also, Scott, are you able to share your presentation? That was another question we had.
Yeah, absolutely. I need to cut some backup slides out of it, and definitely can share.
Okay. Well, anything you can share, we're happy to have. And I think, David, is there anything else you want to add, since you have to leave early? Otherwise, after that, we'll turn to we'll turn to Washington State. Oh, whoops, we have one more question.
No.
Oh, no, I guess not. Sorry.
Okay. No, I appreciate it, Marie. I've got nothing else to add. And as we move forward with our study, once we kick it off here in the next couple of months, we'll look forward to sharing our progress with folks as we move forward.
Fabulous. In fact, at that time, let's just plan on circling back and doing another webinar, because I know that plenty of people are interested in this, and as the word spreads, I think you'll be seeing more and more folks from DOTs coming. So next we have David Fleckenstein, who's WashDOT's aviation director, and Max Platz. So we really appreciate you taking time to come today and share information.
Thanks, Marie. I'll just start off by saying, if you look at what Dave Elaine presented and what we're about to present, we could just say ditto and be done with this. But there are some notable differences that we'll kind of talk about. It's a very exciting time for aviation. And it's one of the reasons that we've kind of delved into this, because it's exciting to our staff. It's exciting to many of our constituents within the state that are interested in this. And with that, we kind of want to start off by talking about what's the why behind advanced air mobility for Washington State and for many other people that are interested across the country. This was kind of touched on, but one of the first and foremost points is that the cost, that we look at in regards to facilitating just electrified aircraft to maintain and fuel those aircraft with electricity are notable, as Scott talked about. So what that really does is it opens up opportunities for all those smaller airports across our state and across the country that are really underutilized right now. And it's one of the reasons that we saw the loss of service to some of these communities, because it wasn't profitable to the airlines. So that profitability margin is going to return as some of these aircraft come to market. Within Washington State, we've already done kind of our own analysis that Max will talk about. We have 70 some airports that would facilitate regional air mobility. 61 of those currently do not have any commercial service right now today. So you can just think about the opportunities and how some of the communities are thinking about that as well. We also look at just the impacts from aviation in general within Washington State. Jet fuel and aviation gas, jet fuel by far being the predominant contributor, represents about 21% of the transportation emissions in our state. And so we want to make sure that we can tackle that. And as we look at adding capacity within the state of Washington, it's two of the biggest things that are on people's minds are emissions and noise. And so with advanced air mobility, you have the opportunity to address some of people's greatest concerns about aviation in general. So the next thing we'd like to talk about is where have we been and where do we think we're going. We really started this effort here in Washington as early as 2017. And it was brought to us by a legislator who was thinking about electric aircraft early on. And she essentially said, hey, can we set goals for the state of Washington for electric aircraft? So we got together with a lot of key players, manufacturers, utility companies, maintainers, some of the airlines, FAA, and we did some really early work in terms of, okay, what could we do and what are the opportunities for Washington State? From that, we released a report in 2019 that facilitated a feasibility study for electric aircraft in 2020. And while we were putting the feasibility study together, that's when you really started hearing more and more about eVTOL aircraft and the idea of vertiports that would service urban communities. So from our early start of focusing on regional air mobility, we've now included the aspect of urban air mobility into the aviation system and the planning work that we have going forward. From that, we looked at, okay, we really need to develop a strategy. So what's our strategy going forward? And I'll talk about that just in a minute here in 2021. And just recently, we're in the middle of our Washington State Aviation System Plan update. And we've dedicated a large portion of that to emerging trends. And we've kind of split it up in two parts. Because this space is moving so quickly, we just completed an early look at emerging trends, but as we get ready to complete our aviation system plan, we're going to refine that and we're going to say, okay, what's changed in a matter of a year and a half? And you can bet there will be some things that have changed. One of the biggest benefits to us is something that was just created, and I'm actually on a meeting with the same council in about an hour from now, which is the Aviation Aerospace Advisory Committee. This was a group that was put together by legislators to bring together all of the different entities that are needed within the space of aviation and aerospace. It's headed by our Department of Commerce and Department of Transportation to tackle all of the things that we need in regards to traditional aviation and aerospace and things that we're going to need to do as we set the conditions for the future of aviation and aerospace across the state. And so next, that brings me to our strategy. Our strategy is fairly simple. We want to be able to keep pace with industry and regulators in that we don't want to get too far ahead and make bets at certain airports on, charging facilities and those types of things when there isn't a standard at this time. The FAA is still going through all the rulemaking that would need to be done to facilitate a lot of these things. So we're trying to do what we can at this point without getting too far ahead. Dave, Elaine mentioned what's being done at the national level. We want to be engaged at the national level. I encourage people that are interested in this to be engaged at the national level, because right now is the opportunity to shape how all this is all going to occur across the nation. So we try and participate in those types of forums when we can, NREL, with FAA, with NASA, especially through the NASAO, the National Association of State Aviation Officials. At the basic level, we are encouraging airports at this point to look at basic level planning. If they want to be able to facilitate electric aircraft or hydrogen propulsion in the future, what are some of their considerations? And Max is going to talk about a study that we have ongoing right now with 2 particular airports that are doing just that in terms of what they would need to do to facilitate some of these operations. And then zoning is a big consideration when you talk about things like urban air mobility. So if you start talking about off airport operations, there are a lot of things that are currently on our books that would need to be changed to facilitate some of those efforts. We also know that we need to broaden our state efforts to look at more of a regional effort. It'd be great if we develop all this infrastructure for Washington State, but then what about going to Oregon? What about going to Idaho? What about going to California and on to Colorado? So it's got to be a national effort, and it's got to be linked together. And then again, our basic efforts at this point are planning. And I think you're going to see some of the things that come out in the FAA reauthorization bill that do just that. It's going to help states facilitate planning for all these things that we've been talking about and what Dave Elaine alluded to. I hope it's going to be an FAA reauthorization bill. We'll see. So the next thing that we know that needs to be done is funding. So we've already started a couple things to facilitate not just the ability to have electric aircraft or hydrogen propelled aircraft at your airport, but to transform airports in general to make them more sustainable. Our thought on this is, if you transform your airports and make them and start looking at the sustainability aspect of everything that takes place in an airport, you're going to set yourself up to be able to facilitate electric aircraft charging, for instance. So Max will talk about the study again, but at the base level, if you take a look at everything that operates at an airport that Scott was talking about, if you go back and think about all the power it's going to be required to facilitate public transportation, everybody driving their EVs to the airport, eventually electric aircraft charging, those power requirements are quite large in some areas. In some areas, they might not be. But again, if you do the basic level things to start transforming those airports, you're going to head in that direction regardless. So we started 2 things. Once again, one is airport transformation grants, where we're going to provide funding to converting to electric ground support equipment, things like electric aircraft charging infrastructure, airport clean power production, electric vehicle charging stations, et cetera. And we're doing that, providing 10% of our regular grants, state grants, to those grants. At the state level, with the larger projects, our legislators have said, hey, come to us in December of this year and for the next at least the next 5 years, and tell them what our needs are. And again, this is basic level requirements just to transform airports, not particular to facilitating electric aircraft or something else. And then finally, we know that as Dave alluded to, we've got to work at the national level for the FAA to rethink some of the things that we currently do with funding if we want to transform our airports to become more sustainable. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Max. And Max is going to talk about some of our planning efforts that are underway.
Great. Thank you, David. Yeah, so we are working with all of our airport partners and OEMs that we have in our states, and we're trying to encourage them to adopt electric aviation technology in their planning efforts through their master plan, airport layout plans, et cetera, to really start to identify use cases that they would like to attract, bring in, identify some spots on the airport to support those use cases. Say it's regional air mobility, where would you put a passenger station? Where would you put the charging area for these aircraft using that? And we're also encouraging them to work on improvements for their ground support equipment, as David mentioned, as well as EVs that are coming to the airport to park or drop off people and that sort of thing, as well as having them adopt sustainability practices to help protect the airport for the long term, both environmental sustainability as well as financial sustainability. If we can help airports cut their costs, they can be more efficient and that sort of thing. As David also mentioned, we are including electric aviation as well as hydrogen and SAF in our Washington Aviation System Plan update, which is currently taking place. We just released a white paper, kind of preliminary, and we're going to be actually, can everybody hear me still?
I can hear you, Max.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, my screen just changed here. So, yeah, we're looking to encourage the use of this in our system plan, and how this is really going to be used to expand capacity throughout the state. And we're really excited about the promise of the regional air mobility or distributed air service and what that could mean to open up access to communities. We have 132 airports in the state, and we are, as David mentioned, we have 71 of those that could support with a 3,000 foot long runway or better, with some infrastructure to support these emerging electric aircraft that are under development right now. And only 11 of those 71 actually have commercial service presently. So there's a huge opportunity to connect some of these more remote communities. And Washington, we've always been an aerospace state, and we're looking to continue to create an environment for production, testing, and then the commercial adoption of these sustainable aircraft in the state, which we see a lot of promise and excitement behind. In continuing with that, we have announced our first study that we released, our second study actually, that we released in 2020. We identified 6 beta test airports that met parameters, and those were well suited to support electric aviation with both some demand, the 3,000 foot or greater runway, some sort of passenger facility that or a FBO that could be used as a passenger facility. When we released that, we had a lot of airports express interest in this. So we wanted to kind of broaden this. We had airports that had their own planning efforts underway, or were excited by what we're doing and want to adopt further. So we actually have increased that. We have 17 airports, and really I think that's going to create a great network that we can build on. We push information out to them about this emerging space, as well as any sort of infrastructure information that we have, and just keep the information flowing so that we're all working from a level playing field and getting excited about this. This is a map of what were our sustainable airport partners. So you can see we have a pretty good distribution across the state, and we have testing and production facilities, as well as the airports with the leaf with the lightning bolt. Those are airports that are in some way working on adopting electric aviation in their area. So really exciting. We have a lot of good participation from the airport community in the state, and it's exciting times to be working with our partners on this. David mentioned earlier too, we have a partnership with the University of Washington Center for Sustainable Transportation, and we're conducting an airport electrical survey or study to really dive deeper into what the electric demand for an airport to support some of these use cases. Really, we're using it as a follow-on to our first report, our 2020 feasibility study, and we picked 2 of our partner airports that are already actively engaged with production and testing of electric aircraft or components. So we are talking with the university, working with them and public utilities and OEMs to kind of get a sense of what the demands are going to be, and then how that mixes in with other electrical needs of the community and more electric vehicles being coming online, and how that all plays together. So we're really looking at kind of the general aviation flight training aspect of it, and then as well as that air taxi commuter to include the urban air mobility piece with something similar to a Joby type aircraft. And then really we're wanting to estimate the airside electricity demand and how that fits in with the ground support equipment, as well as EV charging, and then just the general needs of electricity around the airport. All of this kind of put together, this is part of our, from our system plan update. And we're really wanting to create what we're calling the airport of the future, which includes, everything from multimodal connections at airports, vertiports, the uncrewed aircraft systems, hydrogen, electric, and as well as the sustainable aviation fuel component of it, including on-site power generation, and really kind of trying to create this sustainable aviation network and hotbed that Washington State has the potential to become. So we're really excited about what the future has to offer in terms of this technology in our state. And we're really thankful that we have a lot of good partners with the airports and the OEMs that are based in our state, that we can really, we can kind of start seeing this stuff shaping right in front of our eyes. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Marie and open up for any questions.
You're muted, Marie. Can anybody else hear Marie?
No, I'm not getting her either, David.
Hi, yeah, we'll certainly make this available. Marie, I believe Marie has a copy of it already.
While Marie's getting back online, Max and David, thanks for bringing up the discussion of on-site generation. One of the things that's occurring across the utility industry is that moving where you generate your energy closer to where you're using it can support that existing electrical infrastructure that's over 100 years old, be able to take on some of these loads more effectively.
That's great. We actually just had a really good conversation last week with a airport solar provider that kind of discussing some of that and how that they can play in. Obviously the eastern part of our state gets a lot of sunshine and could maybe take advantage of some of that, which is exciting.
And that's one of the things that we want to be able to fund through that, either the airport transformation grants or the sustainable aviation grant projects. We have one request for adding solar panels to one of our smaller aircrafts that we're currently looking at funding.
The FAA did just release, I believe it was last May, they updated their solar siting requirements, which is something that might be able to help. It opens up more areas because the FAA came to the conclusion after their initial look at solar is that it's not much different than being near a lake. And so the criteria has shifted slightly, which opens up additional areas, especially if you think about legacy airports, World War II legacy airports that have aligned their runways and may have excess area that doesn't have an aeronautical use or non-aeronautical use.
Yeah, that's a great point, Scott. I mean, we have so many airports like that in Washington State where they have just a ton of areas surrounding the airport that they could put to good use for their own power generation requirements.
And we think about, especially when you get into rural communities, power quality is becoming more of an issue. And so moving at some level, the discussion is, does the airport become not just a transportation mode, but also an energy node for the community, helping keep the stability up in that area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I see a question from Gabrielle, and I'll start with this and then I'll turn it over to Max. One of the things that we looked at was basic criteria coming from some of the producers at the time, or the OEMs, was for a 3,000-foot runway. We also looked at the use case for that airport. So we had some airports that it just made sense in where they were headed and their interests in electric aviation. And another factor was pilot training. So we have some of those airports that are on the list that are specifically on there because of their capability to produce pilots. Many of them already have flight training programs, and we want to be able to help facilitate that at a cheaper cost, like David Lane was talking about. Max, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, and so we had these points analysis that we did to determine that at least the initial 6, and then we actually got kind of a bulleted list from there that prioritizes based on that analysis. But it was county level demand analysis, population, annual per capita income, percent population change between 2010 and 2020, and then also tourism related impacts. We also looked at. Can you hear me now? Yeah, we got you now, Marie.
I've put some questions in the chat, Max and David, if you can see those.
Sure.
We're
just about ready to get to those. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah. And so the other aspect we looked at was connectivity with airports within 500 nautical miles, which is kind of the projected range of a lot of things like the Alice and at the time when we started this, the Zunum aircraft. And then economic vitality, such as on-site aerospace manufacturing, and number of employees that are identified as air reliant within 10 miles of the airport. Then we also looked at infrastructure and services, so presence of an FBO or pilot's lounge, and availability of jet fuel. Those were our kind of key points that we looked at. And the jet fuel portion was if the aircraft was to be a hybrid electric. Also, just the fact that they have jet fuel, it's not 100%, but it also can be indicative of larger availability of service at an airport as well. So.
Yeah, thanks, Max. So, Max, I'll talk about the equity aspects, and then I'll turn it back over to Max to talk about the study and when it's actually going to be released. So there's a couple of things about equity I think you need to take into consideration. The first one is just the aspect of being able to provide service in more places to more people, to smaller communities, definitely helps address the equity issue. On the other side of it, there is potential for some of these early entrants to be very expensive. And so you actually eliminate the ability for some people to be able to afford access to some of these systems or aircraft. That's one of the things that we really want to try and avoid. So especially when you think about eVTOL, there's the capability to fold those into current transportation nodes. So if you look at them as just another piece of the multimodal structure, there's ways that DOTs can help ensure that those early entrants are more equitable than otherwise being used solely for private use for the, the rich and the famous to move from point A to point B. Max, do you want to comment on the study itself in terms of when it's going to be released?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm assuming perhaps you're maybe referring to our the 2020 study, the electric aircraft feasibility study, which is released and it's on our website for anybody that's interested. But we're also in the midst of the system plan study, and we have our white paper, or at least our initial white paper. That if anybody is interested, I believe we can share it. It's somewhat draft form, but if anybody's interested, they can reach out and we'd be happy to share. So.
Okay, thanks so much. Are there any other questions? Let's see. Did you already get this one from Gabrielle here?
Yeah, Gabrielle, one of the things that we're doing is we hold a number of different meetings with airport managers. We talk to commissioners in different counties. We do things specifically for small airports. And over the past couple of years, there have been kind of forums dedicated to planning and consideration for just zoning and what you could do at your airport. So we have some airports that have gone to the extent that they've identified, pseudo locations on their airports where they would like to have electric aircraft infrastructure. And so while they have pavement torn up for other projects, they're going ahead and sticking conduit in the ground. So when the time comes, they don't have to tear up that concrete again or asphalt. They can just run the wire through that conduit and be ready to facilitate some electric aircraft charging needs. So those are some of the small things that we're encouraging airports to consider, as well as trying to put things on their ALPs as much as the FAA will allow them at this point, and to put them into their airport master planning process.
And I'd like to also add on to that, as far as the zoning and kind of community outreach portion, we've seen kind of, or been using this as a bit of a tool too. We have our airports and compatible land use guidebook. It's very similar to what Caltrans has, but we try to get airports to adopt zoning to protect the airport from incompatible land use. And so sometimes, this is a good bargaining chip, I don't know if that's the right term, but it's incentive for a community to want to keep the airport, because it has the potential. It's already an economic driver, but this has the potential to make it much further of an economic driver for the community. So having the ability to expand commercial service to some of these small airports that aren't seeing that right now is kind of all the more incentive to protect the airports that they currently have.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We are right at the end of our period, and clearly we're going to have to come back to this topic. Anyone who's on who might want to speak at the next one, in addition to getting an update from those we heard today, we'll try to do that. Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And we'll see those of you who are interested in rural transit next month, and then EV fleet transition on the 4th Tuesday in August. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you, Marie.
Thanks, Marie.